Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Age Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we have another installment for our tier list series as we talk about my top 36 flex players for the 2022 fantasy football season. Today's list will consist of running backs, wide receivers, tight ends, and quarterbacks, which should give you an idea as to what the first 3 rounds of your upcoming draft should look like and how I personally rank those given players. Now, for those of you who haven't seen my prior videos, I've already gone ahead and talked about my top 30 quarterbacks, top 40 running backs and wide receivers, and top 24 tight ends this offseason. So be sure to check that out if you're trying to hear me talk about these players at an extended rate. Again, I talked about running backs for an hour and 20 minutes the other day. I talked about 40 running backs, 3 minutes a pop, giving you some context as to why I like those players and why I differentiate their values of their potential going into this upcoming season. So if you haven't yet, be sure to check those out. And of course, subscribe to the channel because we're making fantasy football content on the daily in order to help you win a 2022 fantasy football championship. So if you're trying to help yourself do that, be sure to subscribe to the channel below. Thank you very much. Now, for those of you who are wondering, today's tier list is for a half PPR scoring format, meaning everyone in the middle, whether you do play in a standard league or in a full PPR league. So I know that there are, pretty significant changes when we talk about changing the scoring format. So for those of you who are looking for my 2022 fantasy football draft rankings for a half and full PPR scoring format, if you're looking to get those, you can do that via Underdog Fantasy. Again, if you travel to the description of the video, travel to Underdog Fantasy and make a first-time deposit using promo code Andrew today. I think the first-time deposit is a minimum of $10. Not only will you get my 2022 fantasy football draft rankings for a half and full PPR scoring format by tier at the quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end, kicker, defense positions, along with my top 200 flex, you will also get a first-time deposit match up to $100, and you'll also get the ability to draft some teams, gain some experience prior to your upcoming drafts, or maybe go ahead, make some pick'ems, because I know week one's lines are already out in terms of over-unders on specific statistics. You can check that out today. Use promo code Andrew. And once you go ahead and sign up, you will get the rankings from me within 24 hours. So if you want those before this upcoming weekend, do that today. Sign up using promo code Andrew. Thank you very much. All right, let's go ahead and let's start talking about my top 36 flex going into this upcoming season. Again, this should give you a little bit of an idea as to how I have these players ranked and how I would respectively approach it in my own upcoming drafts for a half PPR. So let's go ahead and begin with our number 1, Jonathan Taylor, the first player that should be coming off of your draft boards in 2022. Nonetheless, we've talked about him at an extended rate, but what really separates him from the pack is that he's only going into his 3rd year, so he's got youth on his side. He has never missed a game due to injury in his entire career. Over the course of the last 22 games, he's averaged 21.75 fantasy points per game, 28 touchdowns throughout that span of time. This is a team that has been number 2 in terms of total running back rushing attempts since 2018. They have a huge upgrade at the quarterback position going from Carson Wentz to now Matt Ryan, who's only going to elevate their offense, get them into the red zone, and give more opportunities for Jonathan Taylor to score fantasy points. On top of the fact that this offensive line will finally be fully healthy this upcoming year. Again, last year they had 9 different starting offensive line combinations. When you have a chemistry issue and when you have so many rotating pieces, it's that much more difficult to execute. And yet, Jonathan Taylor continued to find success last season. Those levels are going to continue to rise going into 2022. And regardless of what we see from a Nyheim Hines or any of these other offensive pieces, the elevation that Matt Ryan presents to this offense will keep everyone square and, of course, keep Jonathan Taylor at the very top. Moving on to the next player of our S tier, we have Christian McCaffrey. He has to be into this conversation. Again, when we're talking about potential high upside players, I understand that Christian McCaffrey has only played 8 healthy games over the course of the last 2 years, but he is still one of the only running backs that can do what he does. In the last 24 healthy games, he's averaged 24.82 half PPR fantasy points per game. Again, he's one of these running backs that, of course, is going to get so many receptions and so much work in the receiving game that he doesn't even need to score touchdowns. In the last 8 games where he didn't score a touchdown, he's still averaging 18.16 fantasy points per game. I can very easily say that there are no other running backs in the league right now that can consistently produce at that level without scoring touchdowns. And that's what makes him such a unique fantasy football prospect and worth the risk at times. Even if we don't get a full season of Christian McCaffrey, we get 13 games out of him. At the level in which he's played in the last 3 seasons, he is still going to be putting up 315, 320 plus fantasy points, which certainly gets him into this conversation and makes him a viable early round selection in your upcoming draft. If you're worried about a potential future injury in the 2022 season, again, you can avoid Christian McCaffrey, but I personally feel confident enough to have him as my number 2 player. Moving on, the final player I wanted to mention regarding the S tier, we have to involve Derrick Henry in regards to a top 36 flex list at the top because of the level of production he has gone ahead and presented. This is a man that last season, prior to his broken foot, was averaging 29.9 opportunities per game and over 24 half PPR fantasy points per game. Like over the last 33 games with Ryan Tannehill under center, he's been averaging over 21 fantasy points per game. He has totaled over 4,000 rushing yards, was on pace last year to having another back-to-back season of 2,000 rushing yards. Like, Derrick Henry is just not built the same. He's literally built differently. And going into 2022, while many people look at him and think, Derrick Henry is going to get hurt again. He broke his foot. He recovered. He returned a lot sooner than people actually thought he would, and even played in the playoff game and had 20 rushing attempts. I think he's going to be at a full capacity this year. This offense is going to continue to revolve around him as they've lost A.J. Brown, but they've brought in a lot of other pieces that will hopefully prevent defenses from always stacking the box. But let's be honest, even if they do, Derrick Henry is going to find success. Let's go ahead and begin the A tier. Talking about our first wide receiver for a half PPR, Cooper Kupp. Again, Cooper Kupp is a very special player. The fact that he won a Super Bowl, was a Super Bowl MVP, and was a Triple Crown winner, we will probably not see that ever again. He made history in the 2021 year. And though he did so, many people are expecting him to see some regression. And I agree, we are going to see some regression. 367 half PPR points, the number one overall player in comparison to all wide receivers, running backs, and tight end last year. Yes, we're going to see some regression. But even then, we're talking about a player that got an immense amount of volume in terms of targets, 191. There's a reason why he broke the record for most games in a season with 7 or more receptions. 15 of those games, he broke the record for most games of a receiving touchdown and 100 plus receiving yards. 9 of those games last year. But even if we do see regression, let's say, for example, Cooper Kupp last year didn't even score a touchdown. He went from scoring 16 to 0 in one given year. He still would have been the number 4 overall wide receiver last season, which gives me that much more confidence in the idea that this offense is going to continue to revolve around him, continue to make him the primary option. And even with Matthew Stafford's elbow, I'm not too worried about that. I purely think that the doctors are going to take care of it. They've limited him in the preseason and in training camp in order to make sure that he's ready to go for the 2022 year so they can defend their championship. Moving on to Justin Jefferson. Again, he needs to be in this exact same conversation because truly, I think Justin Jefferson can elevate to a Cooper Kupp level of production, mainly because you're getting an offensive change. You're bringing in Kevin O'Connell, the former offensive coordinator of the Los Angeles Rams. He is now the head coach. When you have an offensive-minded head coach, you're more likely to go for it on fourth down. You're more likely to make riskier plays because you're not a defensive-minded head coach. You're not thinking, yeah, you know what, my defense will handle it. There are going to be different decisions made every single week that are only going to open up more opportunities for Justin Jefferson and this offense. And luckily for Jefferson, he's got a stud quarterback, Kirk Cousins. In terms of fantasy production, yeah, he's been a top 12 guy. And in terms of football, many people look at him and think, he's just an average quarterback. In all honesty, he is the perfect quarterback for this scenario. A guy that already has experience with Kevin O'Connell, has thrown for over 4,200 passing yards and 33 touchdowns in each of the last 2 seasons. Again, I only think Justin Jefferson is going to elevate. His rookie year was the number 6 overall wide receiver. He jumped up by 46 fantasy points to the number 4 overall wide receiver. Let's go ahead. Let's tack on another 40 points, elevate him to the number 2 this year in a half PPR, finding a lot of success overall. Moving on. Austin Ekeler is the final player I wanted to mention as the A tier. Again, I did read an article a little bit earlier today in regards to Sony Michel visiting the Los Angeles Chargers. I have no confirmation as to whether or not he's gone ahead and signed. Perhaps by the time we end up finishing this edit, putting it online, he will have already been signed. But either way, I'm not even too concerned about another running back coming into this offense because that's what we've already anticipated. We believe that Isaiah Spiller was going to be that number 2 guy. Even if you put Sony Michel into this conversation, I still believe that Austin Ekeler is going to be the primary back of this offense and score just as many touchdowns as he did last year. And though many are looking towards regression, let's not forget, Austin Ekeler in 2021 was exactly what Alvin Kamara was for the Saints in 2020. The main crossover being the fact that Joe Lombardi, the former quarterback's coach of the New Orleans Saints, came over and became the offensive coordinator for the Chargers in 2021 and allowed Austin Ekeler to fill in that role. Listen, Austin Ekeler getting himself 47 red zone rushing attempts, the second most amongst all running backs, accumulating 12 rushing touchdowns because of those opportunities, on top of the fact that he led all running backs in red zone targets, 16 of them that led to 8 overall receiving touchdowns, behind an elite offensive line that is only improving every single year, in a top 5 offense that is going to continue to get down the field, regardless of whether they're running the ball or passing to him. The opportunities are going to open up on a weekly basis. Austin Ekeler's in a perfect position for 2022. Moving on to our next tier, we begin with Alvin Kamara. Again, I've mentioned this offseason already. You are either all in or all out on Alvin Kamara. You either believe that he is going to avoid this upcoming suspension, they're going to delay the potential court hearings and all that stuff, and that's going to move into 2023, or you believe potentially he's going to face said suspension. If you think the suspension is looming, then you should avoid him at all costs. Now, if you're someone who's willing to take the risk and believe, everything that we've heard is potentially going to lead to Alvin Kamara pushing that suspension to 2023, then why not go ahead and get a discount at a top-tier running back, prospect going into your 2022 season? Again, even without Drew Brees in the lineup last year, he was an incredible player with even Jameis Winston. Weeks 1 through 7, Alvin Kamara was averaging 18.08 fantasy points per game throughout that 6-game span, averaging 5.5 targets and 4.17 receptions. Now, when we talk about weeks 1 through 9, prior to his injury, he was the number 5 overall running back in fantasy football. He has always been a top 12 back in fantasy, and I don't think 2022 is going to be any different. When we have guys like Adam Schefter coming out and saying it is very unlikely that we are going to see a suspension in 2022, it gives me confidence to make the selection of Alvin Kamara, whether it is in the first round or maybe you might be able to go ahead and get him in that second round because others are thinking, yeah, the suspension is coming. I don't want to invest in that. You can get a discount for a top 5 running back. Moving on, we have Dalvin Cook. Listen, the entire offense is going to elevate. There's a reason why we have 2 Minnesota Vikings already on today's tier list, because when you bring in Kevin O'Connell, not only is the passing game going to improve, but it's going to force defenses to not be able to stack the box against the Dalvin Cook, who over the last 2-3 years has been an unstoppable force for this offense. In fact, with Kirk Cousins under center, in the 38 games that he has played, again, he's been averaging 19.92 fantasy points per game. He's been a top 5 running back in 2019 and in 2020. Obviously, the injuries that he sustained last year knocked him out of that contention. But again, that's one of the primary conversations that revolves around Dalvin Cook. Can he stay healthy? He has never stayed healthy for his entire career. But even when he has gone down with an injury, the backups they have brought in, Alexander Mattison, Mike Boone, they've always found success. So if you go ahead and handcuff him, there's not going to be any doubt in my mind that the starting running back of the Minnesota Vikings, whether it is Dalvin Cook for 14 weeks and Alexander Mattison for 2 weeks, is going to find success in fantasy football. With a pivot in terms of their offensive approach, it's only going to elevate all of their potential prospects. Moving on, we have Jamar Chase, another wide receiver I wanted to mention. Listen, Jamar Chase had one of the best rookie wide receiver seasons of all time. Obviously better than OBJ, only a couple points in terms of fantasy behind Randy Moss from 1998. Double-digit touchdowns, and quite frankly, didn't have that many targets last season. But now that you go ahead and you're just only improving as a player, the entire team that surrounds Jamar Chase is only going to improve, because what they did this offseason was completely revamp this offensive line. We have brand new 4 starters from left guard, center, right guard, and right tackle. That in itself is going to only elevate the potential of Jamar Chase because it protects Joe Burrow. Last season, Joe Burrow was the most sacked quarterback in the National Football League, yet he still was the number 1 quarterback in terms of passing completion percentage with 70%. On top of it, adjusted passing completion percentage, he was number 1 still with a 79%. 80% of this man's passes were going to be completed unless a wide receiver was the issue, or a batted down pass, or a throwaway because no one was open. There is so much potential for Jamar Chase to be able to follow his aspirations and complete and be a Triple Crown winner, to be a guy that is going to be a double-digit receiving touchdown player in this league once again. We've seen a lot of potential from Jamar Chase, and I only believe that's going to elevate as you continue to protect Joe Burrow, because every receiving threat in this offense will continue to have more time to develop their routes, find themselves open, and quite frankly, Jamar Chase already showed us in his rookie year, not too many cornerbacks can cover him on a weekly basis, which will only help his fantasy point production. Moving on, we have Joe Mixon, another one of these Cincinnati Bengals. Again, we want to mention this because in the same breath, that offensive line completely being changed, getting 4 new starters, is only going to help Joe Mixon. As this team, marches down the field every single drive, he's going to have those red zone opportunities. He's going to continue to run the ball behind a far better offensive line. Let's not forget, Joe Mixon has been this guy. I know many people look at his 2021 stats and think, wow, he finally has come to be, the Joe Mixon that we thought he would be. No, he's been this guy since week 8 of the 2019 season in London against the Los Angeles Rams. In the last 31 games as the starting running back of this team, he's averaged 16.42 fantasy points per game because he's been averaging 22.19 touches per game. Zach Taylor gave him the nod and said, yes, you are going to be our primary back, and we're going to give you all the opportunity in the world to succeed. And he's done that even since 2019 when the Bengals were awful. This has been a back that has always been in that top 12 running back conversation throughout his entire career, even in the days in which the Cincinnati Bengals could not win games. Now you have a brand new offensive line. You have a quarterback and a wide receiver core that is taking over the league. The defense is only improving every single year. Joe Mixon's in a perfect position. I think the only thing that holds him back is the fact that he doesn't get more receptions, but ultimately, it's nothing that I'm, too worried about in 2022. The final running back or player I wanted to mention in the B tier is Najee Harris. Najee Harris is going to be the pivotal part of this Pittsburgh Steelers offense. Again, the Pittsburgh Steelers have always had successful running backs. The fact that Najee Harris came in and was a top 5 back in his rookie year didn't really surprise many of us. On top of the fact that when you look at the history of rookie running backs who have come into the league and been top 6 fantasy prospects in their first year, every single one of them since 2016 has been able to repeat an RB1 season, which gives us more confidence. On top of the fact that, like I mentioned, the Steelers running backs have always been relevant in fantasy football. Whether we go back to 2014, in the last 8 seasons, we have seen 6 running backs from the Pittsburgh Steelers all be top 6 players in their given year. D'Angelo Williams, Le'Veon Bell, of course, James Conner, and Najee Harris. 6 out of the last 8 seasons. The only 2 seasons that didn't come to fruition was when James Conner was injured in 2019 and in 2020. Otherwise, we found a lot of success here. And when we're talking about a player that they literally aren't taking off the field, last season he played the most snaps amongst all running backs in the National Football League. 86% of the offensive snaps for the Pittsburgh Steelers, handling 86% of the backfield opportunity, which is a combination of rushing attempts and targets. My goodness, Najee Harris is a perfect player to just keep giving the ball to and find more and more opportunity. 400 touches is in line this upcoming year, and regardless of how efficient he is, he's still going to find a lot of success. They've made improvements to this offensive line in terms of bringing in a brand new center and a right guard. And when you don't have Big Ben Roethlisberger in the lineup, I know that there is a potential for his overall receptions to diminish. But what I have seen in terms of the splits since 2019 with Big Ben Roethlisberger out of the lineup, running backs have averaged 2.5 fantasy points more per game on average with him out of the lineup. The sky's the limit for Najee Harris. I think he's in a perfect position this year. Moving on, let's talk about Travis Kelce to begin our C tier. Now listen, when we talk about the drop-off in production at the tight end position, obviously the tight end position as the rounds go on begins to diminish relatively quickly. But when you go ahead and compare a Travis Kelce, potentially the number 1 tight end going into the 2022 year, a guy that could very easily reclaim his spot at the very top, in comparison to running backs and wide receivers, if we anticipate that Travis Kelce is going to step up and have an even better season in comparison to last in 2022 because there is no longer all those targets going into the direction of a Tyreek Hill, and that's going to somehow be filtered in his direction, then we're in line to very easily see 230 points from a Travis Kelce in a half PPR scoring format, which in terms of drop-off comparisons makes him a perfect pick at the back end of the first round. Now, Travis Kelce, of course, over the last 4 seasons since Patrick Mahomes has become the starting quarterback of this team, has had 130 targets minimum per year, has scored double-digit touchdowns in 3 out of the last 4 seasons, and has never played a game less than 70% of the offensive snaps. Again, he does have the moniker of being a tight end and being the tight end 1 from 2016 through 2020, but don't forget, he has been one of the best receiving options in the league since 2017. He has been number 3 in terms of total receptions amongst all players in the National Football League. In the 7 games he played without Tyreek Hill since 2019, he's averaged 13.43 half PPR fantasy points per game. So why not go ahead, elevate his overall potential production, and find a lot of success this year at the back end of the first round. Moving on to DeAndre Swift. Listen, Swift is in a perfect position to pretty much exactly pick up where he left off last year. Last season, weeks 1 through 11, prior to his injury, was the number 7 overall running back in fantasy football, averaging 15.8 half PPR fantasy points per game. Now we approach the 2022 year with his offensive line being fully healthy. They have a top 5 run blocking offensive line without a shadow of a doubt in my mind. And with a team that wants to continue to dictate the game via running the ball, they're going into that direction. They want to bite kneecaps and they want to go ahead and win in the trenches. And that's exactly what they're going to do this year. They're going to run the ball consistently with DeAndre Swift. And as long as this team is going to be in negative game scripts, of course, DeAndre Swift is going to benefit from the fact that the targets are going to be in his direction. We saw it a lot last season, and it's only going to continue in 2022. Again, he has the potential of being, not only a top 10 running back, but being top 5 because of that receiving upside. As long as touchdowns accommodate his weekly performances, his elevation in terms of production is only going to rise. All right, let's go ahead and move on. Let's talk about the next running back on today's tier list. It is Saquon Barkley. All right, so Saquon Barkley, again, when you go back to 2018, 2019, he was one of the best fantasy backs in the league, averaging 19.74 half PPR fantasy points per game throughout a 28-game span. Gets hit with the ACL injury, out for 2020. And then in 2021, we heard a lot of, we don't know if we're going to allow Saquon Barkley to play the first month of the season. He may be limited. A lot of the same conversations that revolve around J.K. Dobbins going into this year. But we took some risks on Saquon Barkley last year. We knew the inherent risk of it. And a lot of us got burnt because not only was he not fully healthy in terms of his knee, he also sustained that ankle injury and just wasn't the same all season long. But we've heard everything that we've wanted to hear this offseason. We heard him say this offseason that he's trusting his knee again, that, he feels better than ever in terms of his overall potential, even in comparison to his rookie year. Those statements themselves give me so much confidence in the potential. And though this may be just things that he's telling the press, everything that we've seen from training camp, all the clips we've seen, he looks like the Saquon Barkley of old. Now the New York Giants go into 2022 with a far more competent offensive line, with a brand new right tackle, right guard, and center. Their left tackle, Andrew Thomas, is getting into that elite level. You have Brian Daboll coming in as the new head coach / offensive coordinator. Everything is going in the right direction. And we've even heard Saquon say that I'm moving around the formations into places where I haven't even been since I was at college at Penn State. They're moving him into the slot. They're going ahead and diversifying his utilization, because if you're going to use a running back of his caliber that has the ability to catch the ball out of the backfield, why not go ahead and do that all across the field? Moving on, let's talk about Stefon Diggs. When you're talking about a consistent wide receiver option that you can pick blindly and find success in 2022, Stefon Diggs is exactly that guy. Over the last 2 years, he's been the number 3 and number 7 overall fantasy wide receiver, averaging over 10 targets per game and over 15 fantasy points per game. Now, obviously, we no longer have Emmanuel Sanders and Cole Beasley in this lineup. That's vacated 184 potential targets. Now, in the last 2 years, we've seen Stefon Diggs accumulate 165 and 166. You go ahead and sprinkle a little bit more on the top, those numbers were only going to elevate. And even in a division where he's played against some pretty good cornerbacks, Stephon Gilmore, J.C. Jackson, Xavier Howard, Byron Jones, in the last 12 games against the AFC East, he still averaged 16.87 fantasy points per game. Stefon Diggs is a wide receiver that is going to continue to be a part of that top 5 conversation year in and year out. And as long as he's associated with Josh Allen and this top tier Bills offense, the sky's the limit as a consistent wide receiver option here. Moving on, let's talk about the next tier of players, beginning with Davante Adams. Speaking of consistent wide receivers, my goodness, in the last 2 years, Davante Adams has been special. Over 10 targets per game, obviously 10.85 with Aaron Rodgers, 20.85 fantasy points per game in the last 27 contests he played with A-Rod. He has had 10 or more touchdowns in 5 out of the last 6 seasons and has just completely taken over the league. But now, he's changing his scenery. He has traveled to the Las Vegas Raiders and is going to join his former college teammate and best friend, Derek Carr. Back at Fresno State, the final year they played together in 2013, Davante Adams, 131 receptions, 1,700 receiving yards, and 24 receiving touchdowns. With Josh McDaniels being the new head coach of the Las Vegas Raiders and being the former offensive coordinator of the New England Patriots, I know they're not, easily compared, but the last time Josh McDaniels had an elite wide receiver at this caliber was when they had Randy Moss in New England. Outside of that, think about the wide receivers that have played for the New England Patriots over the last decade. Edelman has probably been the best player amongst that entire group. So you go ahead and you add Davante Adams with an offensive coordinator that has the mind to just completely dominate defenses on a weekly basis. I think this is going to allow Davante Adams to be a consistent threat within this offense and a consistent fantasy point producer. He may not be as great as he has been in seasons past, but he's certainly going to be, a pretty stable wide receiver for us in 2022, especially considering there really isn't a need to build a rapport with Derek Carr because it already exists. Derek Carr, in the last couple of years, we've seen him give, 146 targets to Darren Waller. Why not go ahead, sprinkle in, an additional 14 on top of that, send that in the direction of Davante Adams, 160 targets. For that wide receiver, it's a piece of cake in terms of fantasy points. Moving on, let's talk about CeeDee Lamb. Listen, CeeDee Lamb is going to be asked to do a lot this year, and hopefully they're going to play him more in the slot once Michael Gallup returns, but CeeDee Lamb should be able to take over and be easily a top 6 fantasy wide receiver, considering this team is going to be throwing a lot this year, And they no longer have an Amari Cooper or Cedric Wilson, which opens up 164 total vacated targets. We have CeeDee Lamb being the de facto number one of this offense. And any time last season, Dak Prescott was in a pinch, whether he was being blitzed, whether it was a third down, he always continued to target CeeDee Lamb. CeeDee Lamb led the Dallas Cowboys in those categories when Dak Prescott was under pressure. We know that he is going to continue to get the ball in his direction, but he needs more opportunity. We can't see him sit around 120 targets and hope for success. We need very easily 160 going in his direction. And if they want to win games, they're going to have to do the same. The fact that he has only averaged 7.6 targets per game over the last 21 games with Dak and 12.5 fantasy points is not enough. When we've gone ahead and looked at the numbers from CeeDee Lamb, in games where he was targeted 6 or more times, he's averaged 15.96 fantasy points per game. And 8 of those 10 contests have consisted of 10 or more fantasy points. That's 80% of the time. Those are the numbers that I'm talking about. Those are the numbers we want to see this year. Again, hopefully he gets some play in the slot position because that's only going to allow him to have more advantageous matchups against defenders. Moving on, we have Leonard Fournette in the D tier. Leonard Fournette has kind of moved around since we last talked about him in our prior running back tier list video. Leonard Fournette every single week becomes more and more of an idea in my mind that he's just going to pick up where he left off. Again, from weeks 4 through 14, this guy was absolutely taking over the league, averaging 18.8 half PPR fantasy points per game, while also averaging 6.3 targets and 5.0 receptions per contest. Of course, when you're associated with a Tom Brady-led offense, especially when Tom Brady is throwing for 5,000 yards in a given year, they're going to continue to score. This is an elite offense to say the very least. And the complete through line of Tom Brady's career is that the fact that he's always liked to dump it off to running backs. You go back to the last 4 seasons he's played with the New England Patriots. James White, 95 targets, 123 targets, 86 targets, 72 targets in those given years. You even talk about Byron Leftwich, Bruce Arians back with the Arizona Cardinals in 2016. David Johnson had 120 targets in a year and 80 receptions. What we've seen all this offseason in terms of preseason since Tom Brady came back was that Leonard Fournette was the only running back to play with the first team. Rashad White, Keyshawn Vaughn, Giovanni Bernard, they're going to play occasionally, but it's not going to make a huge difference to lower the value of Leonard Fournette in 2022. Moving on, Aaron Jones is the other running back I wanted to mention. Listen, Aaron Jones is a fantastic running back. We've talked about it all offseason. When Davante Adams hasn't been in the lineup, since 2019 in the 8 games in which that has been the case, Aaron Jones has averaged 25.68 fantasy points per game. We know he is a consistent running back. He's always been a top 12 player in the last 3 years, has always been able to put up over 1,100 total yards, 10 plus touchdowns, 47 receptions over the course of the last 3 seasons. He's a consistent player that you want to go ahead and draft in that second round because you know what you're getting out of him. Again, in the last 45 games, he's averaged 16.19 fantasy points per game, has scored 40 touchdowns in those last 45 games. And though we're getting rid of Davante Adams from the lineup, I think the implementation of A.J. Dillon is going to slow down that overall potential burst of upside that Aaron Jones may have. But let's not forget, Aaron Jones has been the number 2 receiving option for this team. You look at the last 3 seasons in terms of total targets and receptions, Aaron Jones has been the number 2 receiving option. Maybe he ends up being the number 1 this year and makes his overall positioning in this flex spot look a little bit underwhelming, but overall, this is where I expect him to place. Moving on, we have Mark Andrews. Listen, Mark Andrews was the number 1 tight end last year, and the reason why he was able to accomplish that is because more opportunity came into his hands. Prior to 2021, he had played 457 snaps that went into a season in which he played 598 snaps, and last season, 934 total offensive snaps, which obviously elevated him from going from 88 targets to 153 targets. That level of upside is unbelievable. On top of the fact that he has scored himself 10, 7, and 9 touchdowns each of the last 3 seasons, those numbers, as long as they continue to be a main factor, Mark Andrews is going to continue to be a top 2 tight end. I see him as the number 2 this year because the numbers in which he was able to put up with Huntley and Josh Johnson last year, 45% of his total offensive fantasy point production were from 6 of the 17 games. That's most likely not going to be the case in 2022. But with that all being said, if he continues to play more and more, when he has played 70% of the offensive snaps, he's averaged over 14.5 fantasy points per game. He's done that 17 times in his entire career, 12 of them coming in 2021. Hopefully that number continues to increase in 2022. The more he's on the field, the more opportunity for upside he has. Moving on to Mike Evans, another one of these consistent wide receivers beginning the E tier. For the last 8 consecutive years, he has surpassed 1,000 receiving yards. In the last 2 seasons with Tom Brady, He's averaged over 14.3 fantasy points per game and has consistently been putting up over 72 catches, 1,000 receiving yards, and over 10 receiving touchdowns. If you're going to continue to maintain in that conversation, the fact that Mike Evans has scored 27 touchdowns in the last 30 healthy games he has played for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. You have Chris Godwin most likely not being at a full capacity to begin with. Mike Evans is only going to get more and more targets and be a consistent fantasy option for us as a second-round selection. Moving on to Deebo Samuel. Again, Deebo's in a similar situation. Though many people look at Deebo and think, well, he had an incredible year. Is there going to be a little bit of regression? Are we going to see him slow down in any capacity? I don't think that's going to be the case. I mean, when you look at just Deebo Samuel's receiving stats as a whole, last season he had 215 fantasy points just off of receiving stats, which would have made him the number 9 overall fantasy wide receiver. Weeks 1 through 9 of the 2021 year, we got to remember, prior to becoming running back Deebo, he was averaging 10.13 targets per game and 17.6 fantasy points per game as the primary wide receiver of this team. On top of the fact that last season, in the games that he played with Trey Lance, the second half against Seattle, the full game against Houston and Arizona, he had 10 catches for 228 yards, 3 receiving touchdowns, 2.5 games, 45.8 fantasy points. A lot of potential for Deebo Samuel. That's why we're continuing to respect him and draft him as such. Moving on to Nick Chubb. We're getting towards the back end of the second round. And why we want to go ahead and, of course, address running back to this point is because we know players like Nick Chubb have a lot of value. Again, when he has played with Kareem Hunt, in which it looks like is going to be the case this year, in the last 18 games that they have played together, Nick Chubb is still averaging 16.03 fantasy points per game. Behind an elite offensive line with the 2 best offensive guards in the league. Obviously, probably you want to mention Zach Martin for the Cowboys in that conversation. So 2 of the best 3 in that regard. In an offense that has ran the ball the 3rd most amount of times since 2020 because of the implementation of this offense from Kevin Stefanski. Of course, Nick Chubb is going to continue to be their primary back. He's going to continue to carry the ball and just be a stud. And regardless of whether a trade happens or not, Nick Chubb absolutely needs to be selected at this position. Moving on to James Conner. Listen, James Conner, he keeps moving up and down my board because some days I feel more confident while others I don't. And I don't know what the worry is for me, mainly because I know he's going to score touchdowns. I know that's going to be a given. I mean, we looked at last season's stats. He was the number 2 running back in terms of red zone rushing attempts inside the 5-yard line. 16 attempts for 10 touchdowns. The year prior, when he wasn't even there, when Kenyon Drake was the primary back, Kenyon Drake was the number 3 running back in that category. Red zone rushing attempts inside the 5-yard line. 21 attempts for 9 rushing touchdowns. Of course, the primary back for the Arizona Cardinals in back-to-back years has surpassed 10 touchdowns. So I know James Conner is capable of doing that. And you eliminate Chase Edmonds from this lineup. Again, last year in the 6 games he played without Chase Edmonds, he was averaging over 21.5 fantasy points per game. If you get into that conversation once again, James Conner, of course, has incredible upside, and that's why I'm moving him up my board. I feel like every single time I think about James Conner and what he could potentially produce this upcoming year within this Arizona Cardinals offense, I think the receptions, the touchdowns, the rushing attempts are all going to be there, making him a prime overall fantasy prospect that we should have on our roster. Moving on to Javonte Williams, another one of these players that, again, keeps moving up and down my board because I'm expecting Melvin Gordon to take a little bit of a step back this year, but how much is that going to be? We know that Nathaniel Hackett is going to bring in a Green Bay-style offense, which they use a lot of Aaron Jones and A.J. Dillon last year, but Aaron Jones, prior to his injury, was the main priority of that offense. So is that going to be the role for Javonte Williams, a guy that is going to be a main contributor in the receiving game while also being a goal line back and getting majority of those touches? If that's going to be the case, then by all means, Javonte Williams is very easily going to be in this top 14 running back conversation. But if we get more utilization out of Melvin Gordon, he starts vulturing touchdowns down on the goal line, gets a lot more receiving work than we anticipated, then we'll be in a little bit of trouble. But I'm hoping Javonte Williams and his skill can branch off and prove that he is the primary back of this team. They should have, honestly handed it off to him last year. The fact that they delayed it, I know is a different regime, different coaching staff, was a little bit disappointing, but nonetheless, we're going to go ahead and make that up in 2022. Moving on, we have Tyreek Hill beginning the F tier. Again, though it's the F tier, quote unquote, it's not a failing grade. We're talking about the top 40 players, and we're talking about them by splitting hairs going top to bottom. These are still elite players in the beginning of the 3rd round, late 2nd round that you want to have on your teams. So let's talk about this. Tyreek Hill. A lot of people look at him and think, yeah, you know what? Tua's not going to get the job done. Guys, it is such a narrative that I love to hear because it allows Tyreek Hill to drop down draft boards and make him that much more affordable fantasy option. With Alex Smith in 2017, he was the number 4 overall wide receiver. He put up nearly 210 fantasy points. With Matt Moore in 2019, in 3 games, he was averaging 16.5 fantasy points per game. And I know he's being pulled out of the entire Kansas City Andy Reid offense, but with Mike McDaniel, potentially using him as a running back at times, similar to the way Deebo was last season, to then allowing Tua to throw the ball, 50, 60 yards down the field, which is only going to find success for this offense. Again, last season, in terms of adjusted passing completion percentage, Tua was number 1 amongst all quarterbacks in terms of passes 20 or more yards down the field. Again, when you look at Tua's stats, yes, he hasn't looked incredible. His average depth of target over the last couple of years hasn't been great, but don't forget, he hasn't had a Tyreek Hill in this offense. He hasn't had an offensive line. He's had to get the ball out of his hands quickly. They've gone ahead and patched up all those holes. The offense is going to look great this year, and so is Tyreek Hill. Moving on to Ezekiel Elliott. Again, I still think Zeke is going to be a primary back for this team and find a lot of success. In the last 6 consecutive years, he has totaled over 1,250 total yards. He's had 8+ touchdowns every single year throughout that span of time. In the last 4 consecutive years, 47+ receptions. Has only missed 1 game in his career due to injury. And even though he had a partially torn PCL last year, didn't really give up much. Yes, he wasn't producing to the level at which we've seen in the past, but Tony Pollard didn't come in and start taking away touches. In fact, Tony Pollard saw less touches every single week that Zeke was, injured. Not only did Tony Pollard see less overall opportunity, he saw less overall total fantasy points per game. That only gives me more confidence in the potential of investing in Zeke because we know he is going to be the primary back of this offense, the goal line back that is going to find a lot of success in fantasy. Moving on to Michael Pittman Jr. Again, Michael Pittman is going to have the pleasure of being the number 1 wide receiver option of a Matt Ryan-led offense. And I understand many of you say, he's not Julio Jones. He's not Calvin Ridley. But understand that even if you go back to Roddy White had multiple years of 160+ targets with the Atlanta Falcons. Even Harry Douglas had a year of 132 targets. So regardless of where you are on that spectrum, there are going to be a lot of opportunities going in the direction of Michael Pittman Jr. And the increase in terms of quality and quantity in comparison to what Carson Wentz was putting forth last season, which is only going to allow Michael Pittman Jr. from going to being the number 15 overall half PPR wide receiver last year to being in that top 10, conversation, top 12 to say the very least. Moving on, we have Mike Williams. Listen, Mike Williams was a top 10 fantasy wide receiver last year, but a lot of people look at him and think, he kind of tailed off last season at the back end of the year. And I 100% agree with you. Weeks 1 through 5, he was the number 1 wide receiver in fantasy, averaging 20 points per game. The rest of the time, weeks 6 through 18, was only averaging 9.8 fantasy points per game. That's a pretty big dip. But you have to remember, there were a boatload of opportunities in which he did not score touchdowns. There were 5 or 6 opportunities within the 5-yard line where he was tackled, or it was an incomplete pass, or the defender made a play on the ball, which prevented him from scoring touchdowns. Again, this is a player that had career highs in targets, receptions, receiving yards, and was 1 away from matching his career high in total touchdowns last year. As a player that I 100% wholeheartedly believe in is going to score more touchdowns this year and is going to continue to be a vital part of this offense, those fantasy point numbers are going to look very similar to the way that they did last year. They probably won't be as bunched up as it was in 5 singular games at the beginning of the season. They'll spread out. He'll score more touchdowns across the board, making him that much more of a viable fantasy option for our given weeks. Moving on to T. Higgins. Again, I've talked about this in the past. T. Higgins, when he has played with Jamar Chase in the lineup, has had just as many targets per game and has found just as much success. The only difference maker is the fact that Jamar has scored more touchdowns throughout that span of time. But when you go to weeks 8 through 17 of the 2021 season, he was the number 7 overall wide receiver throughout that time, averaging 14.67 fantasy points per game. While Jamar Chase was the number 8 overall wide receiver throughout that time. So they were back-to-back, both top 8 fantasy wide receivers, and both producing incredible numbers. Now you get into a conversation where Joe Burrow is getting a brand new offensive line. He's going to probably elevate his game to 5,000 yards, 40 passing touchdowns, which is going to allow him to support 2 top 12 wide receivers, which implies that T. Higgins is going to be one of those. Last year, if he had kept pace and not missed a single game due to injury, T. Higgins was going to be a top 10 fantasy wide receiver in terms of total fantasy points scored. Why not go ahead, draft him as such, because he truly is going to be exactly that this year. Moving on, we have Josh Allen. So I wanted to go ahead and bring up Josh Allen because at this current point, when you get into the middle of that 3rd round, when you have the opportunity of drafting a 400-point passing quarterback, you should probably go ahead and do so. Again, this is a quarterback that has had 4,600 passing yards, and 36 plus touchdowns each of the last 2 seasons. He has averaged 24.17 fantasy points per game since 2020, has been the number 1 quarterback in back-to-back years. So why not go ahead and see another incredible season from him? In the last 2 seasons, his rushing point contribution has averaged 100 points per year. On top of the fact that he has been an incredible passing quarterback, the fact that he's getting those levels of influx just off of his rushing stats alone. I mean, again, in terms of passing statistics, he's pretty much identical to Kirk Cousins, which Kirk Cousins was the number 11 quarterback last year. But if you were to add 100 points on the Kirk, of course, that would make him a Josh Allen at that point. When you go ahead and improve his offensive line, you bring in Quisenberry and Roger Saffold, both offensive linemen formerly of the Tennessee Titans, who helped allow Derrick Henry to get to that 2,000-yard mark. 2 guys that are top 12 at their position in terms of run blocking grades, according to Pro Football Focus. I think the sky's the limit for Josh Allen. I think he goes ahead and has a, three-peat here in terms of being the number 1 quarterback in fantasy. Now, after we get past the first quarterback off the board, we got to talk about the third tight end off the board. Kyle Pitts. There's been a lot of hype surrounding Kyle Pitts, whether it was his rookie year and the fact that he was the highest drafted tight end of all time, going into having the greatest fantasy tight end rookie season of all time, 142.6 half PPR points. And now we go into a conversation where he's being associated with Marcus Mariota instead of Matt Ryan. Again, Mariota, in the 57 career games he has played healthy, he has targeted his tight ends 8.3 times per game, which has led to 12.84 fantasy points per game. Delanie Walker, from 2015 through 2017, was the number 6, 5, and 4 overall tight end. And again, I can assure you, Delanie Walker is not as good of a receiver as Kyle Pitts is, yet he was able to find a boatload of success. Kyle Pitts is going to be in this conversation, and when we look at the drop-off in production at the tight end position, at this current range, based on the available running backs and my projections of them and the available wide receivers, I'd much rather have a 190-point potential tight end that has even more upside than a 200-point wide receiver. Speaking of wide receivers, let's talk about A.J. Brown. In an offense that is going to be very similar to the one that he played in with Tennessee, in the idea that it's going to be a run-first scheme. Again, even though that's going to be the case, Ryan Tannehill was able to get him the ball a consistent amount of times, 23 targets in the first 35 games they played together. Again, 14.26 fantasy points per game. So if Jalen Hurts continues to find that connection and builds the rapport that we all expect him to with his best friend in A.J. Brown, the elevation of play from both of them should be apparent. Again, as of this season, the Philadelphia Eagles have the easiest strength of schedule at the wide receiver position and the 4th easiest at the quarterback position. They should be blowing teams out and finding a lot of success. That's why A.J. Brown continues to be in this top 15 wide receiver category, because he has incredible potential upside. And as long as the opportunity is there, he'll be able to deliver on that. Moving on, Keenan Allen. Again, Keenan Allen's been one of the most consistent wide receivers in fantasy. In the last 5 consecutive years has been the number 14 or better wide receiver. So why not go ahead and leave him at the number 14 spot at the position? I got that with Justin Herbert, has averaged over 10.78 targets per game and 14.16 fantasy points per game in the last 27 games they've played together. Again, one of the best wide receivers in the league, has been number 1 in receptions since 2017, 3 receptions ahead of Davante Adams and just a few more than Travis Kelce. Keenan Allen is a stud. If you have the opportunity of grabbing him in your 3rd round, you should do so. Moving on, let's talk about Courtland Sutton. Speaking of a top 15 wide receiver, I talked about this in my video yesterday. When you are the number 1 wide receiver for a Russell Wilson offense, you're going to be a top 15 candidate, because that's exactly what he has produced over the last, 7 seasons since 2015. Doug Baldwin was always a top 15 wide receiver. So was Tyler Lockett, and so was DK Metcalf. And as long as they continue to allow Courtland Sutton to be that deep receiving threat for this offense, that is exactly where DK Metcalf found a lot of his opportunity and a lot of his overall production. So with a complete overhaul at quarterback, at offensive coordinator, I expect Courtland Sutton to step up to the next level and reclaim his wide receiver 2 standing like we saw a couple years back. Moving on, we have Josh Jacobs of the Las Vegas Raiders. I've talked about Josh Jacobs a lot. Throughout his entire career, he has always been in that top 12 running back conversation. His rookie season prior to his injury was the number 11 overall running back. The following year was the number 8. This last season was the number 14. But when you look at weeks 4 through 18, he was a top 12 fantasy running back in terms of total fantasy points per game. In fact, it was averaging 14.32 fantasy points per game last season. Throughout that span of time, was identically the number 8 overall back. You put him in an offense that is only elevating because of the pieces that surround Derek Carr, with a new offensive coordinator that doesn't get bored of running the ball, that has shown that over the last 5 years with the New England Patriots. They have given their running backs the most opportunities amongst all teams in the league. Why not Josh Jacobs going ahead and elevating his game once again? Moving on to Travis Etienne, another running back that I'm looking to invest in these early rounds. Listen, Travis Etienne could very easily be this season's DeAndre Swift in the idea that he's undervalued because of the idea that we are not 100% sure whether or not Doug Peterson is going to commit to him. But the last time we've seen Doug Peterson commit to a running back, Miles Sanders, he's been a top 15 player. I think Travis Etienne, by far and away, is a more talented back who will have far more opportunity as a receiving threat in this offense, which is only going to elevate him on the board. I mean, from all that he has shown from college at Clemson with, his former starting quarterback, Trevor Lawrence, who is now still his starting quarterback, that rapport is going to continue to build and continue to allow Travis Etienne to fly off, draft boards relatively early, and rightfully so. All right, let's go ahead, and I'm just going to encompass all these other guys. I know we've already gone past our top 36, but let's go ahead. Let's talk about Allen Robinson. He's joining an offense that is going to be the best that he's ever played in within his entire career. He has already proven back in 2019 and 2020 he could be a top 12 overall wide receiver. I don't expect him to get to those numbers, but I expect him to get to where exactly Robert Woods was last season, even OBJ, where they were both putting up incredible points as a number 2 receiving option of this offense. We move on to DJ Moore. DJ Moore has consistently been a wide receiver that, even though he has had a rotating quarterback position, whether it has been Cam or, Kyle Allen, Will Grier. There's just been so many guys that have been the starting quarterback of the Carolina Panthers over the last couple of years. PJ Walker, Sam Darnold, Teddy Bridgewater. He's still maintained as the number 18, 22, and 19 overall wide receiver in fantasy football. With Baker, is it going to get that much better? If he scores more touchdowns, yes. Otherwise, he's pretty much in that same position. Moving on to Diontae Johnson. I think regardless of who is throwing him the ball, the fact that he finds himself open in more scenarios than not will allow Mitchell Trubisky to throw it to him and, of course, find a lot of success in fantasy football. A guy that over the course of the last 2 years has the most games of 10 or more targets. And we're talking about in comparison to Keenan Allen. We're talking about even in comparison to Davante Adams. Diontae Johnson is just a special player and will continue to be for Pittsburgh this year. The final player I wanted to mention to close off today's list, it is Marquise Brown. Again, last season, prior to Lamar Jackson leaving, he was the number 17 overall wide receiver in an offense that did not like to throw the ball very much. Now you go ahead and add him into an offense with his best friend, Kyler Murray, former college teammate, in a Cliff Kingsbury scheme. I think Marquise Brown should be stepping up and finding a lot of value. Either way, these are my top 36 to 40 flex players for the 2022 fantasy football season. Thank you, everybody, for watching. If you want more details regarding a bunch of players, be sure to, again, check out the prior videos I posted here on the channel. Be sure to subscribe if you're trying to help yourself win a 2022 Fantasy Football Championship this year. And of course, sign up via Underdog Fantasy if you are looking for my half and full PPR, fantasy football draft rankings. Again, all you got to do is make a minimum of a $10 first-time deposit using promo code Andrew. Not only will you get a first-time deposit match, we'll be able to draft some teams and, of course, gain some experience that way, but you will also get an email from me the following day with those rankings, which will also be updated this upcoming Saturday in the AM. So if you want those rankings before you draft, be sure to sign up sooner rather than later. Thank you, everybody, for watching, and until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.